April 19, 1989, the Persian Gulf. The thunder that rolls across the placid, oil-tinged waters is not a natural phenomenon. It is a man-made concussive cataclysm, a 9-gun salvo from the forward turrets of the USS Iowa, BB-61. 16-inch, 2,700-pound high-capacity explosive shells trace a high, arching trajectory over the geometric horizon, vanishing into the desert haze before detonating with apocalyptic force on the desolate Kuwaiti island of Failaka, silencing Iraqi artillery positions. The range is approximately 22 nautical miles. For the first time since the Korean War, the colossal guns of an Iowa-class battleship speak in anger, a stunning, anachronistic display of naval gunfire support in the age of jet fighters and cruise missiles. Global media fixates on the awesome spectacle, the sheer, visceral power of these steel behemoths from a bygone era. The reports, broadcasts, and documentaries consistently anchor their awe with a legendary, almost mythical statistic, a maximum range of 23 miles. This figure, repeated in museum placards, history books, and pop culture references, has solidified into an immutable fact in the public consciousness. But it is, in critical and fascinating ways, a profound oversimplification. The truth about the Iowa's 16-inch guns and their 23-mile range is a far more complex narrative of theoretical physics, practical engineering, evolving naval doctrine, and the brutal transformative evolution of warfare through the crucible of World War II and the long shadow of the Cold War. It is a story where a single rounded number obscures a deeper reality of capabilities, limitations, and secrets. To excavate this truth, we must begin not in the late 20th century, but at the dawn of total global conflict. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. The devastating surprise attack by Imperial Japanese naval air forces plunged the United States into World War II and seemingly delivered a final, tragic verdict on the battleship's primacy. The wreckage of the Pacific Fleet's battle line, smoldering in the shallow waters of Battleship Row, appeared to be the tombstone of an era, starkly vindicating the profits of aerial dominance. Yet, in a profound paradox, even as salvage crews surveyed the devastation, 3 of the most powerful and advanced battleships ever conceived by any nation were in the final stages of fitting out in American shipyards: the USS Iowa BB-61, New Jersey BB-62, and Missouri BB-63. A fourth, the Wisconsin BB-64, would soon follow. The Iowa class was the ultimate expression of the fast battleship concept, a design philosophy forged in the tense pre-war years. They were not mere incremental improvements, but a holistic answer to a complex strategic equation. Their design was dictated by a singular, demanding requirement born of emerging tactical reality. They must be fast enough to keep pace with and escort the new Essex-class fleet aircraft carriers, which naval strategists now understood were the true capital ships of the modern era. At the same time, they had to possess sufficient size, armor, and firepower to defeat any rival battleship afloat in a traditional gunnery duel. Specifically the mysterious and massive Japanese Yamato class, rumors of which deeply concerned U.S. naval intelligence. Their primary armament, the reason for their existence as gun platforms, were 9 16-inch 50-caliber Mark 7 naval rifles, distributed in 3 triple-gun turrets, 2 forward in a super-firing arrangement, turrets 1 and 2, and 1 aft, turret 3. The nomenclature 16-inch by 50 caliber is precise. The bore diameter was 16 inches, or 406 millimeters, and the barrel length was 50 times that bore diameter, resulting in a rifled tube of forged and machined steel 67.7 feet, or approximately 20.3 meters. These were not the largest guns ever mounted on a warship. The Japanese Yamato's 18.1-inch or 460mm main battery holds that title, but they are widely regarded by historians and ordnance experts as the most sophisticated, accurate, and ballistically efficient heavy naval rifles ever placed in service. The public conception of range for such a weapon, a single impressive number, is a fundamental misunderstanding of naval gunnery. In reality, maximum range is not a fixed attribute like length or displacement, but a dynamic product of a multifaceted equation. For the Mark VII gun, this equation hinged on three primary interdependent variables: the quantity and type of propellant, the weight and aerodynamic design of the projectile, and the elevation angle of the gun barrel itself. The standard propellant charge for the Mark VII was known as a full charge. It consisted of 6 individual silk bags, each containing approximately 110 pounds of a granular smokeless powder formulation designated SPD, or smokeless powder disc. These 660 pounds of propellant were loaded into the gun's breech behind the projectile. When ignited by an electrical primer, they underwent a controlled rapid deflagration, not a detonation, generating a titanic gas pressure of roughly 55,000 pounds per square inch within the sealed breech. This expanding gas was the brute force that propelled the shell down the intricately rifled barrel, imparting a stabilizing spin of about 2,700 revolutions per minute before the projectile exited the muzzle at a velocity of approximately 2,500 feet per second, or 762 meters per second. The standard projectile for much of World War II was the 2,700-pound, 1,225-kilogram armor-piercing shell, Mark VIII. This was a weapon designed for a single brutal purpose: to defeat the hardened steel armor of an enemy battleship. Its construction was a masterpiece of focused intent. It featured a thick, forged steel body with a hardened, pointed nose cap designed to resist shattering on impact. Inside, behind a substantial armor-piercing steel wall, was a relatively small cavity containing only about 40.9 pounds or 18.5 kilograms of explosive D, ammonium picrate. This small charge was not for blast effect, but to detonate after the shell had penetrated the enemy's vitals, hopefully igniting magazines or boiler rooms. The shell's shape was long and streamlined for good ballistic performance, a low drag coefficient, to retain velocity and kinetic energy over long distances. When this armor-piercing shell was fired using the full 6-bag charge, with the gun barrel elevated to its maximum mechanical limit of 45 degrees, it could achieve a maximum theoretical range of approximately 42,345 yards. Converting this to more familiar units, that is just over 24 statute miles, or about 21 nautical miles. This is the crucial origin point of the legendary 23-mile figure. It is a rounded, slightly inflated conflation of this specific ballistic statistic, 24 statute miles, likely originating from wartime press releases, simplified public relations materials, and post-war summaries aimed at a lay audience. 23 miles is more rhetorically pleasing and easier to remember than 42,345 yards, or 24.06 miles. It became a shorthand, a brand identifier for the ship's power. However, this number, whether 24 or 23 miles, represents a ballistic abstraction. It is the product of ideal laboratory-like conditions: a specific shell, the heavy AP, a specific charge, full 6-bag, fired at a precise, fixed 45-degree angle under standardized atmospheric conditions, temperature, barometric pressure, and no wind. It is the absolute outer limit of the gun's physical capability, a datum point on a firing table, not a reflection of common tactical employment. The operational reality faced by the Iowa and her sisters in the vast theaters of World War II was starkly different. Naval gunnery is not a static artillery range exercise.
First and foremost, the primary design opponent for these guns was not a static coordinate on a shoreline 24 miles away. It was an enemy fast capital ship, a Congo-class battlecruiser, a Nagato-class battleship, or the mythical Yamato, a maneuvering, evasive target perhaps 15 to 20 miles distant, capable of 25 to 30 knots. For this envisioned surface duel, maximum range was a secondary consideration. The paramount factors were hitting power, the shell's ability to penetrate armor at the expected engagement range, accuracy, the ability of the fire control system to compute a solution for a moving target, and rate of fire, the ability to get off multiple salvos quickly to walk shots onto the target. The concept of decisive battle range for the U.S. Navy in this period was typically envisioned as between 18,000 and 30,000 yards, 10 to 17 nautical miles. At these ranges, the AP shell's trajectory was relatively flat, its time of flight was shorter, typically 50 to 70 seconds, and the complex fire control solution, computed by the electromechanical analog marvels of the Mark 38 Gun Fire Control System, or GFCS, which had to compensate for the ship's own roll, pitch, and yaw, the target's course and speed, wind direction and velocity, air temperature, powder temperature, and even the Coriolis effect induced by the Earth's rotation, was more manageable and could be updated more effectively. Furthermore, elevating the 1,700-ton triple turrets to the full 45 degrees was a slow, deliberate process, consuming precious seconds. In a fast-moving surface engagement, gun elevations rarely approached this maximum. Practical battle elevations were more commonly in the range of 20 to 35 degrees. At a more realistic 30 degrees of elevation, the range with the standard AP shell was about 32,000 yards, or 18 statute miles. This was the long range of a realistic fleet action, a far cry from the textbook maximum. The second critical layer complicating the range narrative is the shell type. While the heavyweight AP shell was the designated dueling round for fleet combat, the nature of the Pacific War rapidly evolved. After the pivotal carrier battles of 1942, Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz crippled Japanese naval air power and decimated their carrier fleet, the strategic campaign transformed into a methodical island-hopping advance and a grueling series of amphibious assaults. The Iowa-class battleships found their most frequent and devastating employment not in duels with enemy battle lines, but in the relentless bombardment of fortified Japanese islands. For this mission, destroying coastal defense guns, obliterating reinforced concrete bunkers, flattening airfields, and demoralizing troop concentrations, the armor-piercing shell was often the wrong tool. Its hardened body and small bursting charge were designed to penetrate deep before exploding, often limiting its surface blast effect. For shore bombardment, the preferred munition was the 1,900-pound, 862-kilogram, high-capacity explosive shell Mark 13. This was a weapon of area effect and terror. Its thinner steel walls allowed for a massive internal cavity packed with over 150 pounds of high explosive, initially TNT, later the more powerful Composition B. It was designed to detonate on impact or shortly after, creating an enormous crater and a lethal shower of fragmentation. However, its lighter weight and less aerodynamic blunt-nosed shape, optimized for carrying more explosive, not for penetration, resulted in significantly different ballistics. It had a shorter maximum range than the heavier, sleeker AP shell. When fired at the maximum 45-degree elevation with a full charge, the HC shell had a maximum range of roughly 40,000 yards, or about 22.7 statute miles, now intriguingly close to the fabled 23-mile public relations figure. Yet again, this was a maximum under ideal conditions. In the brutal, practical reality of shore bombardment at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, or the Japanese home islands, the Iowa-class ships typically operated at much shorter ranges, often between 10,000 and 25,000 yards, 5.7 to 14 nautical miles. Closing the range improved accuracy dramatically, allowing for precise destruction of point targets, like blockhouses or gun emplacements. It also created a psychological weapon of immense power. Troops ashore could see the colossal ships looming on the horizon, witness the terrifying orange flashes from their broadsides, and then endure the soul-shattering arrival of shells that sounded like freight trains before obliterating their positions. The range in these iconic bombardions was not about pushing a limit, it was about applying overwhelming, precise force. The legend of the 23-mile range, however, was not cemented solely by World War II service. It found a second life during the Cold War reincarnations of the battleships. Decommissioned after Korea, the Iowa class was reactivated and modernized for the Korean War, and again far more extensively in the 1980s under the Reagan administration's 600-ship Navy initiative. These modernizations retained the 16-inch guns, but wrapped them in a new technological ecosystem. The vintage yet robust Mark 38 GFCS was augmented with modern radar, laser rangefinders, and most critically, digital computers. These systems could compute firing solutions faster and with data from new sources, like the RQ-2 Pioneer Unmanned Aerial Vehicle, or UAV, which could act as a remote spotter, circling over a target and radioing back corrections. This dramatically improved accuracy for naval gunfire support, or NGFS, at longer ranges.
But the most significant and classified advance was a new projectile. In the 1980s, the Navy developed and deployed a secret weapon, the RAP, or Rocket-Assisted Projectile. This was a modified 16-inch HC shell with a solid fuel rocket motor integrated into its base. The sequence was ingenious. The shell would be fired conventionally from the gun using a reduced propellant charge. Once it was well clear of the ship and stable in its ballistic arc, the rocket motor would ignite, providing a sustained thrust that extended the shell's range enormously. Declassified data and analysis since the ship's final retirement indicates the RAP could achieve ranges of approximately 50 nautical miles, or about 57 statute miles. This was the true transformative long-range punch of the modernized battleship, a capability that remained highly classified during their 1980s and early 1990s service. The public, the media, and even most of the Navy continued to use the familiar 23-mile figure. It was a convenient, unclassified, and historically rooted placeholder that effectively masked this revolutionary capability. The 1989 bombardment of Philaka Island, a very public demonstration of power, did not use the secret RAPs. It employed standard HC shells, and the engaged range was well within the gun's World War II-era capabilities. The 23-mile statistic reported globally was, therefore, a deliberate anachronism, a simplified truth that concealed a far more potent reality. Therefore, the complete truth is nuanced and layered. The Iowa's 16-inch 50-caliber Mark 7 guns were theoretically capable of firing a standard 2,700-pound AP shell approximately 24 statute miles under ideal textbook conditions, a figure rounded and popularized as 23. Their practical range in their designed World War II surface battle role was typically 10 to 18 statute miles. Their most common wartime use, shore bombardment, saw them firing 1,900-pound HC shells at even shorter ranges for mortal accuracy, though those shells could reach about 22.7 miles at maximum elevation. Their ultimate range potential, unlocked in the Cold War with rocket-assisted projectiles, was more than double the legendary number, a state secret held for decades. The 23-mile range is not a falsehood, but a cultural and historical shorthand, a powerful, enduring symbol of the raw, overwhelming, and seemingly anachronistic force embodied by the last and greatest battleships to sail the world's oceans. It is a simplified echo of their thunderous reality, a number that speaks to their mythic stature while quietly guarding the deeper secrets of their final formidable evolution. To fully comprehend the significance of its range, one must first appreciate the mechanical behemoth that achieved it.
The 16-inch 50 caliber Mark 7 gun was not merely a tube, it was the heart of an extraordinarily complex and robust system. Each gun barrel, manufactured by forging and machining, was actually a composite structure. It consisted of a thick inner liner tube that contained the riffling, the spiral grooves that imparted spin to the projectile. This liner was encased within multiple layers of outer hoops or jackets, essentially massive steel cylinders that were shrunk fit over the liner under immense heat and pressure. This construction technique, known as auto-frettage, placed the inner layers of metal in a state of permanent compression, allowing the gun to withstand the repeated, staggering forces of firing without deforming or bursting. The entire gun barrel assembly weighed approximately 120 tons. It was mounted within a massive, intricately machined gun slide and housed inside the armored citadel of the turret. The turret itself was a fortress with face armor of 17 inches of hardened Class B steel, sloped to increase its effective thickness, and barbette armor protecting the ammunition hoists down to the magazines deep within the ship's hull. The 3 guns in each turret were bag guns, meaning the propellant came in the aforementioned 6 silk bags. The use of bags as opposed to brass cartridge cases as used in smaller calibers was a necessity due to the sheer volume of propellant. It also added a procedural step. After firing, the empty silk bag remnants had to be cleared from the breech, a task performed by sailors wielding long, pole-like swabs. The loading sequence was a precisely choreographed ballet of hydraulics, mechanics, and human effort, designed for a theoretical maximum rate of fire of 2 rounds per gun per minute. In practice, a well-trained crew in wartime could achieve a sustained rate of about 1 round per minute. The process began deep in the ship's magazines, where powder handlers would retrieve the 6 silk bags for a single charge and place them on a conveyor system leading to the powder hoist. Simultaneously, in a separate projectile handling room, a massive 2,700-pound shell would be plucked from its rack by a power-operated hoist. Both the shell and the powder bags would travel up separate armored hoists to the turret's working chamber, a space directly beneath the guns. Here, crewmen would transfer the bags to a mechanical powder car and ram the shell into the waiting breech of the gun, which had been lowered to the loading angle. The powder car would then slide forward, inserting the bags into the breech behind the shell. The massive breech block, a Welland-type interrupted screw mechanism weighing several tons, would then be hydraulically swung shut and rotated to lock, sealing the firing chamber. The gun would then be elevated to the firing angle dictated by the fire control computer. Upon the command "fire," an electrical impulse would trigger the primer, igniting the powder. The entire turret structure, weighing over 1,700 tons, would recoil several feet backward along its tracks, absorbed by hydraulic cylinders. After recoil, the gun would automatically return to the loading angle, the breech would open, and the cycle would begin anew, all while the ship itself might be rolling and pitching in a seaway. The smooth operation of this system under combat conditions was a testament to American industrial design and the rigorous training of the gun crews, who performed their tasks in a deafening, smoke-filled, and highly dangerous environment.
The raw power of the 16-inch gun would have been useless, a blunt instrument without the sophisticated brain that aimed it. The Mark 38 Gunfire Control System, GFCS, was that brain, a network of analog computers, optical rangefinders, radar, and stable vertical elements that constituted one of the most advanced technological systems of World War II. At its core was the Ford Mark 1A fire control computer, an electromechanical analog computer housed in an armored plotting room deep within the ship's hull. This room, manned by a team of specialists, was the nerve center for the main battery. Data flowed into the computer from several sources. The primary optical directors, large binocular-like devices mounted high on the ship's superstructure, the main battery director atop the forward conning tower, and an auxiliary director aft, were operated by crews who would manually lay the crosshairs on the target.
These directors contained stereoscopic optical rangefinders with bases up to 26 feet long, capable of taking extremely accurate range measurements. The act of keeping the crosshairs on a moving target generated continuous electrical signals for target bearing and range rate. By 1942-43, this optical data was crucially augmented by radar. The Iowa-class battleships were equipped with the advanced SG surface search radar and, most importantly for gunnery, the Mk8 fire control radar. The Mk8, with its distinctive orange peel parabolic antenna, could provide an accurate range to a large surface target like a battleship at over 40,000 yards, and its bearing accuracy was also excellent. In conditions of poor visibility, at night or through smoke, the radar became the primary source of data. The fire control computer integrated this constant stream of target data, range, bearing, and their rates of change with data on the ship's own movements. A stable vertical, a sophisticated gyroscopic system provided an artificial horizon, feeding the computer information on the ship's roll and pitch. The computer also factored in ballistic variables, the type of shell being fired, AP or HC, the temperature of the propellant, which affected burn rate and muzzle velocity, atmospheric conditions transmitted from the ship's weather station, and even the rotation of the Earth, the Coriolis effect, which becomes significant over very long ranges. Then it performed, in real time, the immensely complex calculus required to predict where the target would be when the shell arrived 50 to 70 seconds later. It generated firing solutions for each turret, sending continuous elevation and train orders electrically to the turret officers' indicator dials. The turret crew would match pointers to follow these orders, aligning the massive guns. When the solution was stabilized and the ship was at the optimal point of its roll cycle, often synchronized by the computer, the gunnery officer would give the command to fire. The system's accuracy was remarkable. In training and combat, the Iowa-class ships demonstrated the ability to achieve straddles, shells landing both over and short of the target, indicating a correct range solution on enemy ships at ranges exceeding 30,000 yards. This seamless integration of optics, radar, mechanics, and analog computation transformed the battleship from a mere platform for heavy artillery into a precision instrument of long-range destruction. The combat service of the Iowa-class 16-inch guns during World War II provides the essential context for their range capabilities, demonstrating how theory translated into practice. The first combat action came with the USS Iowa herself in early 1944. While escorting carrier task forces in the Pacific, her primary role was anti-aircraft defense with her extensive secondary and tertiary batteries. However, her main guns found their first significant target on February 16, 1944, during the pre-invasion bombardment of the Japanese garrison at Truk Lagoon. Firing at the fortified island of Dublin, Iowa engaged shore batteries and installations. The engagement was not a long-range duel, but a methodical reduction of fixed defenses, with the ship maneuvering at moderate ranges to bring all 9 guns to bear. This pattern would become familiar. The most iconic use of the guns was in the role of shore bombardment during the relentless Allied advance across the Central Pacific. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Iowa and New Jersey, operating with Fast Carrier Task Force 58, were primarily defensive assets. Their main battery moment came not against the Japanese fleet, but in a tragic and famous incident. During the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Iowa mistakenly engaged the USS William D. Porter DD-579 after the destroyer accidentally fired a live torpedo toward the battleship during a drill. While no main battery shells were fired at the hapless destroyer, the incident highlighted the constant readiness of the system.
The true testament to the gun's destructive power came during the assaults on Japan's inner defensive ring. At Iwo Jima in February-March 1945, Iowa, along with other battleships, conducted a prolonged, multi-day pre-invasion bombardment. The guns fired hundreds of rounds, methodically destroying known gun positions, command bunkers, and troop concentrations on the small volcanic island. The range was dictated by the geography and the need for accuracy. The ships fired from various positions around the island, often at ranges well under 20,000 yards, to ensure they could pinpoint the intricate network of caves and tunnels. The sheer weight of shell delivered was more important than extreme range.
This pattern was repeated on a colossal scale at Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War from April to June 1945. The Iowa, Missouri, and Wisconsin, the latter joining the fleet in late 1944, were all present. Their 16-inch guns were central to the softening up process and provided continuous call fire support for troops ashore during the brutal months-long land battle. They engaged in counter-battery duels with Japanese coastal guns, some of large caliber, requiring precise fire at ranges where the enemy's guns could also hit back. The battleships also formed the last line of defense against the massed kamikaze attacks. While their primary anti-aircraft batteries were the 5-inch 38 caliber guns and 40mm Bofors, the main battery was even employed in a radical anti-aircraft role. The ships would fire VT, or variable time, or proximity-fused shells from their 16-inch guns into the paths of incoming kamikaze formations. The concept was to create a wall of shrapnel and concussion in the sky. Firing a 2,700-pound shell to detonate in the air was an immense, if somewhat desperate, application of the weapon system, and while its effectiveness is debated, it underscores the versatility sought from the big guns. The most dramatic surface action involving an Iowa-class battleship occurred on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The USS New Jersey, serving as the flagship of Admiral William F. Bull Halsey, along with the USS Iowa, formed part of the fast battleship line of Task Force 34, which was part of Halsey's Third Fleet. When American escort carriers came under attack by the Japanese center force in the battle off Samar, Halsey's battleships, including the Iowas, were hundreds of miles away, having raced north to engage a decoy Japanese carrier force. The Iowa-class's speed, over 33 knots, allowed them to cover vast distances quickly, but in this critical moment they were out of position. Their 16-inch guns never engaged the vulnerable Japanese heavy cruisers and battleships at Samar, a profound missed opportunity that remains one of the great what-ifs of naval history. When they did finally engage the northern Japanese force, it was a one-sided affair against the light carrier Chiyoda and destroyers, targets better suited to secondary batteries and cruiser guns. The war's only true surface duel for an Iowa came near its end. On July 17 to 18, 1945, the USS Iowa, along with the USS Missouri and supporting cruisers and destroyers, conducted a naval bombardment of the industrial city of Muroran on the northern Japanese home island of Hokkaido. This was a strategic strike, with the 16-inch guns firing at targets over 15 miles inland, including the massive Wanisi Ironworks. The range was extended by using a high trajectory, demonstrating the gun's ability to reach deep into coastal areas. After World War II, the Iowa-class battleships were briefly mothballed, only to be hastily reactivated for the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. Here, their mission was almost exclusively naval gunfire support, or NGFS, for United Nations forces. The USS Missouri arrived off the Korean peninsula in September 1950 and immediately began bombarding enemy positions, railways, and supply dumps. The guns proved brutally effective, particularly during the Incheon landings, and later during the stalemated fighting along the main line of resistance. The doctrine was refined. The battleship would operate independently or with a small screen, using spotter aircraft, and later early helicopter spotters, to direct fire onto targets often obscured by Korea's mountainous terrain. Ranges were typically modest, under 20,000 yards, as the goal was precision in support of frontline troops. The Missouri's final main battery salvos of this era were fired in March 1953 against communist positions near Kojo. After Korea, the ships were again deactivated, and many believed the era of the battleship had finally, definitively ended. The 1980s reactivation under President Ronald Reagan was a strategic and political statement. In the context of Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union, the battleships were seen as multi-mission platforms. Their official role encompassed NGFS, but also anti-surface warfare, or ASUW, and, critically, as the centerpiece of a surface action group, or SAG, designed to threaten Soviet naval bastions, particularly the Kola Peninsula. The 16-inch gun was re-evaluated in this light. Against modern missile-equipped ships, its range was inferior to anti-ship missiles like the Harpoon. However, analysts posited unique advantages. The gun was immune to electronic countermeasures. You could not jam a 1,700-pound shell. Its rate of fire, while slow compared to missiles, delivered a massive weight of explosives on a target area. Against hardened shore targets, like bunkers, airfields, or port facilities, it was argued to be more cost-effective and survivable than using expensive cruise missiles, especially in a contested electromagnetic environment. This led to the development of the secret RAP projectile, which aimed to close the range gap with missile systems and give the battleship a standoff bombardment capability. The modernized ships entered service with their new systems. The 1989 bombardment of Philaka Island by the USS Iowa during Operation Praying Mantis was a highly publicized demonstration of this renewed capability. However, just months later, tragedy struck. On April 19, 1989, a catastrophic explosion occurred in the center gun, Gun 2 of Turret 2, aboard the USS Iowa during a training exercise in the Atlantic Ocean. The explosion killed 47 sailors instantly. The subsequent investigation, initially and controversially, suggested sailor sabotage, a theory later thoroughly discredited. The true cause was ultimately linked to an accidental over-ram of the powder bags, which may have created a dangerous overpressure condition in the breech when combined with the use of an unauthorized experimental propellant mix. The disaster cast a long shadow on the battleship reactivation program, raised serious questions about the safety of the aged gun systems and their crews' training, and contributed to the decision to finally retire the ships for good in the early 1990s following the end of the Cold War.
This pattern was repeated on a colossal scale at Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War from April to June 1945. The Iowa, Missouri, and Wisconsin, the latter joining the fleet in late 1944, were all present. Their 16-inch guns were central to the softening up process and provided continuous call fire support for troops ashore during the brutal months-long land battle. They engaged in counter-battery duels with Japanese coastal guns, some of large caliber, requiring precise fire at ranges where the enemy's guns could also hit back. The battleships also formed the last line of defense against the massed kamikaze attacks. While their primary anti-aircraft batteries were the 5-inch 38 caliber guns and 40mm Bofors, the main battery was even employed in a radical anti-aircraft role. The ships would fire VT, or variable time, or proximity-fused shells from their 16-inch guns into the paths of incoming kamikaze formations. The concept was to create a wall of shrapnel and concussion in the sky. Firing a 2,700-pound shell to detonate in the air was an immense, if somewhat desperate, application of the weapon system, and while its effectiveness is debated, it underscores the versatility sought from the big guns. The most dramatic surface action involving an Iowa-class battleship occurred on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The USS New Jersey, serving as the flagship of Admiral William F. Bull Halsey, along with the USS Iowa, formed part of the fast battleship line of Task Force 34, which was part of Halsey's Third Fleet. When American escort carriers came under attack by the Japanese Center Force in the battle off Samar, Halsey's battleships, including the Iowas, were hundreds of miles away, having raced north to engage a decoy Japanese carrier force.
The Iowa-class's speed, over 33 knots, allowed them to cover vast distances quickly, but in this critical moment they were out of position. Their 16-inch guns never engaged the vulnerable Japanese heavy cruisers and battleships at Samar, a profound missed opportunity that remains one of the great what-ifs of naval history. When they did finally engage the northern Japanese force, it was a one-sided affair against the light carrier Chiyoda and destroyers, targets better suited to secondary batteries and cruiser guns. The war's only true surface duel for an Iowa came near its end. On July 17th to 18th, 1945, the USS Iowa, along with the USS Missouri and supporting cruisers and destroyers, conducted a naval bombardment of the industrial city of Muroran on the northern Japanese home island of Hokkaido. This was a strategic strike, with the 16-inch guns firing at targets over 15 miles inland, including the massive Wanisi ironworks. The range was extended by using a high trajectory, demonstrating the gun's ability to reach deep into coastal areas. After World War II, the Iowa-class battleships were briefly mothballed, only to be hastily reactivated for the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. Here, their mission was almost exclusively naval gunfire support, or NGFS, for United Nations forces. The USS Missouri arrived off the Korean peninsula in September 1950 and immediately began bombarding enemy positions, railways, and supply dumps. The guns proved brutally effective, particularly during the Incheon landings and later during the stalemated fighting along the main line of resistance. The doctrine was refined. The battleship would operate independently or with a small screen, using spotter aircraft and later early helicopter spotters to direct fire onto targets often obscured by Korea's mountainous terrain. Ranges were typically modest, under 20,000 yards, as the goal was precision in support of frontline troops. The Missouri's final main battery salvos of this era were fired in March 1953 against communist positions near Kojo. After Korea, the ships were again deactivated, and many believed the era of the battleship had finally, definitively ended. The 1980s reactivation under President Ronald Reagan was a strategic and political statement. In the context of Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union, the battleships were seen as multi-mission platforms. Their official role encompassed NGFS, but also anti-surface warfare, or ASUW, and, critically, as the centerpiece of a Surface Action Group, or SAG, designed to threaten Soviet naval bastions, particularly the Kola Peninsula. The 16-inch gun was re-evaluated in this light. Against modern missile-equipped ships, its range was inferior to anti-ship missiles like the Harpoon. However, analysts posited unique advantages. The gun was immune to electronic countermeasures. You could not jam a 1,700-pound shell. Its rate of fire, while slow compared to missiles, delivered a massive weight of explosives on a target area. Against hardened shore targets, like bunkers, airfields, or port facilities, it was argued to be more cost-effective and survivable than using expensive cruise missiles, especially in a contested electromagnetic environment. This led to the development of the secret RAP projectile, which aimed to close the range gap with missile systems and give the battleship a standoff bombardment capability. The modernized ships entered service with their new systems. The 1989 bombardment of Philaka Island by the USS Iowa during Operation Praying Mantis was a highly publicized demonstration of this renewed capability. However, just months later, tragedy struck. On April 19, 1989, a catastrophic explosion occurred in the center gun, Gun 2 of Turret 2, aboard the USS Iowa during a training exercise in the Atlantic Ocean. The explosion killed 47 sailors instantly. The subsequent investigation initially and controversially suggested sailor sabotage, a theory later thoroughly discredited. The true cause was ultimately linked to an accidental over-ram of the powder bags, which may have created a dangerous overpressure condition in the breech when combined with the use of an unauthorized experimental propellant mix. The disaster cast a long shadow on the battleship reactivation program, raised serious questions about the safety of the aged gun systems and their crews' training, and contributed to the decision to finally retire the ships for good in the early 1990s following the end of the Cold War. Placing the Iowa's 16-inch gun within the global context of contemporary battleship armament is revealing. The two most direct rivals were the British and Japanese. The British Royal Navy's last battleship, HMS Vanguard, commissioned 1946, was armed with 8 15-inch/42 caliber guns. These were older but proven weapons with a maximum range of about 35,000 yards, or 19.9 miles, with a lighter shell. The British favored a balanced design and used a supercharge only in specific circumstances. The Iowa's guns offered greater range, heavier shell weight, and superior muzzle velocity. The true rival was Japan's Yamato class. Armed with 9 18.1-inch/45 caliber guns, these were the largest naval rifles ever mounted. They fired a truly monstrous 3,220-pound or 1,460-kilogram armor-piercing shell to a maximum range of about 42,000 yards or 24 miles, remarkably similar to the Iowa's 16-inch gun on paper. However, ballistic analysis reveals critical differences. The Japanese shell, while heavier, had a poorer ballistic shape, a lower sectional density, and less efficient design, and the propellant used was of lower quality. This resulted in a lower muzzle velocity, around 2,600 FPS for AP, but the Iowa's gun was more efficient. More importantly, Japanese fire control technology, particularly radar, was markedly inferior to the American Mark 38 GFCS by 1944-45. In a hypothetical engagement at very long range, the Yamato might have a slight advantage in sheer penetrating power if it hit, but the Iowa would likely have held a significant advantage in hitting first and hitting more accurately, thanks to its superior radar-directed fire control. The Iowa's higher speed, 33+ knots versus Yamato's 27 knots, also granted it the crucial tactical ability to control the range of engagement. Against other contemporaries like the German Bismarck 15-inch guns or the Italian Littorio 15-inch guns, the Iowa's 16-inch/50 caliber gun provided a clear margin of superiority in both range and projectile weight. The American industrial approach favored high velocity and sophisticated fire control over sheer caliber size, a philosophy that reached its zenith in the Mark 7. The story of the Iowa's 16-inch guns and their 23-mile range is, in its entirety, a microcosm of 20th-century naval warfare. It begins with the pre-World War II dreadnought arms race, culminating in a weapon of exquisite technical refinement. It sees that weapon applied in a global war that rapidly evolved beyond the fleet action for which it was designed, finding brutal utility in the grim work of amphibious assault. It survives into the Cold War, adapted and modernized, its range expended by rocket science to remain relevant in the missile age, before meeting an ignoble end in peacetime tragedy. The 23-mile figure endures because it is a perfect symbol. It is a number that conveys immense power in a simple, graspable form. It speaks to the battleship's role as a long-range arbiter of force, a sovereign piece of territory capable of projecting devastating influence far over the horizon. Yet, as we have seen, the operational truth was always more nuanced. The gun's most effective ranges were often shorter, dictated by the need for accuracy, the nature of the target, and the tactical situation. Their ultimate secret range, with RAP, was far greater, a capability hidden in plain sight behind the familiar legend. Today, the last of the great guns sit silent. The Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin are preserved as floating museums, their turrets forever trained on symbolic bearings. Visitors can stand on their decks and marvel at the size of the barrels, trying to imagine the sound and fury of a full broadside. The 23-mile range is recited by tour guides, a lasting echo of the ship's once world-shaking voice. It is a simplified truth, but a powerful one, a numeric monument to an era when the power of a nation could be measured in the inches of a gun's bore and the miles its shells could fly, an era that closed forever with the last thunderous salvo from the USS Wisconsin in 1991. The guns are quiet now, but the legend of their reach, in all its complex reality, continues to resonate.